Hello, good stuff. Right, and thank you all for coming out. I'm Harry Roberts. My talk is Breaking Good Habits. It kind of deals with web standards and how we need to sort of redefine them for today's web. A little bit about me. I'm a designer and developer from the UK. Not much of a designer of late because for the last year or so, I've been working as a senior UI developer for BSkyB. Anyone who doesn't know BSkyB, we're a fairly massive media organization with fairly massive websites, and senior UI developer basically means a pretentious way of saying I write HTML and CSS for a living. I also write and tweet at CSS Wizardry, which I think is officially the worst brand name on the internet. I came up with that when I was 17. I thought it was brilliant, and I'm kind of stuck with it now. Aside from that, I am the chief flirt clearer on an app called Favourite. It's a new web app that I put live last month, and it's kind of a living testament to the fact that the things I'm about to talk about over the next half an hour can, will, and do work on a production website. New ways of thinking, new ways of working have gone into Favourite, and that's live now, and it works. It's kind of proven that we can change the way we build websites. We can break our good habits. So what do I mean by breaking good habits? Well, for the last few years, the web's changed very rapidly, but the rules we live by typically haven't. Web standards have been written for many, many years, and no one's really been updating them. No one's been going back to check whether our web standards and our current good habits are still appropriate. And in the last year of working at Sky, I've worked on one website in particular, and it took me an entire year to build it. And the habits that I learned in the previous 3 years as a web developer were no longer suitable. And I had to break those good habits in order to build better websites. So I'm going to mention web standards a lot. And web standards, I don't want to diss web standards. Web standards are a great idea, but they're not without the drawbacks. One of the good things web standards has given us is things like accessibility. If we're using semantics properly, the chances are we're building a much more accessible website. Things like, you could have a developer over here in Poland or a developer over in the States, and they don't know each other exist. But they both build websites in a similar manner because web standards have kind of defined a common way of working, and that's really good. But the problem with web standards is they're a bit ambiguous. They're very open to interpretation. What one person takes as meaning one thing, another person could take as meaning another. If you remember a few years ago, we were told to stop using tables for layout, and then there was a slew of people who started stopping using tables altogether. We had people building tables using list items, and it was really bad. But that's because no one's written anything down. Web standards aren't rules, so people can interpret them however they want, and that's often a bad thing. But on the flip side, a good aspect of that is because nothing's written down, we don't have to adhere to these things. We don't have to acknowledge they exist. We can rewrite and redefine our own web standards. If we find something doesn't really work for us, we can just go and ignore that and start making something that does work. And because the web's changing faster than our rules, I think it's down to people like us, the people on the ground who are still building the websites, to try and redefine them ourselves. We didn't ought to wait for the next Zeldman. We need to start doing this ourselves, noticing the things that go wrong in our own projects and start rewriting them ourselves from now onwards. Web standards gives us a set of best practices, but we've got to ask who are they best for? Who are we actually trying to solve problems for here? I think that in any web project, there are typically 3 people we need to keep happy. That's a massive generalization, but typically it's the same 3 people. The users, because without the users, there's no point having a website. We need to keep the clients happy. If we don't keep the clients happy, we don't get to eat. And the third person, the person I think we overlook the most, is ourselves. We need to keep ourselves happy. Just as a quick test, who's ever looked at the source code for Google or Facebook? The majority of you, and how ugly is that? It's disgusting, but as a user, we don't care. We know that those sites are fast, they're efficient, and they never break. That's a problem that's been solved for the user. The clients, they likely don't care what the code looks like either. They want to know that their site doesn't break every other day. The only people who really care about code is the developer, and we've got to ask, are we caring for the right reasons? And I find a lot of the time we don't care for the right reasons. Web standards gives us a series of perceived good habits, and you'll notice I use the word perceived there. We're told we shouldn't use too many IDs or classes, and Andy Clark once tweeted, every time you use an ID or a class as a style hook, you should put $1 in a swear jar. And I think that's really bad advice. I think that's really dangerous advice. And we shouldn't really do things like that. Just because someone says we shouldn't use classes doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. We're also told we should handcraft our CSS, and I think this is a very unwise approach to take. Even though CSS isn't a programming language, it is still subject to things like dryness and efficiency, and to treat code like art is impractical. You don't get points for being pretty because no one looks at your source code and judges it. They just care how well your website works. You don't get points for being pretty, you get points for being powerful. And to handcraft your CSS is to treat it like an art form, which is not a sensible thing to do. We have a set of perceived bad habits. We're told that you shouldn't use too many classes. But like I said before, web standards are very ambiguous. How many is too many classes? We all like beer, but you can have too much beer, but that's different for everyone, and you don't really know where to draw that line, and no one can tell you where to draw that line. A very specific example I've got is grid systems. People typically shy away from grid systems because it's extra classes, extra markup, and they're in semantic classes. I've got a full section on grid systems coming up, but one thing I want to hit on is the fact there's no such thing as an insemantic class. It's sensible or insensible. Classes aren't subject to the same semantics as HTML elements are, so we need to stop worrying about insemantic class names. So with that in mind, I think we've been solving the wrong problems for the wrong people. Avoiding using classes and IDs to keep ourselves happy doesn't actually help us. We need to make sure we're solving the right problems for the right people so that we have better lives as developers, our clients get more robust websites, and our users get better experiences. So if we're going to work towards this, I work towards what I call the 4 illities. Now, I feel really bad showing you a slide like this. It's a bit patronizing. I feel like a school teacher. But this is honestly the best way I can think to describe it. If we strive for maintainability, flexibility, extensibility, and predictability in our code, we can often build much better websites that are solving the right problems for the right people. Flexibility can be, maintainability is fairly self-explanatory. I won't need to explain that one too much, but flexibility can be things as literal as our components flexible? Do we have fixed widths everywhere, or can we move things? Will our code bend, or will it break? And if we know that it's going to break, we can predict where that will break and fix the bugs before they even happen. Extensibility is how quickly can we scale a site up and out? Have we got a code base that's flexible enough to build on top of? Or have we built a very rigid, inflexible site that we can't extend? So maintainability then. I've spent the last year of my life working on this one ginormous website, and it's really changed the way I think. And now I've got the job of maintaining it, and that sucks. No one likes maintaining websites. Building them's the cool thing, looking after them sucks. You're never going to enjoy it, but you can at least make it easier. And every bit of code you write, think about how well you can look after it 6 months down the line. Flexibility then. I've got a really good example of inflexibility. This is a very exaggerated example, I'll admit, but selectors like this do get written, and that's all for the sake of avoiding using a class in your HTML because someone said once that you shouldn't use classes. I'm just going to step over to my laptop. So here we've got the first child that's a P, that's a child of the first child that's an article, that's a child of the second div, that's a child of the body. Now, I did say this is an exaggerated example, but here we've got 10 checks. We've got to do 10 things before we can style that P. That's very inflexible. If the P changes to a block quote, that selector breaks. If the P changes its location, that selector won't work. If we remove the article, that selector won't work. That's very inflexible. And that's all just so we can avoid using a class. That's a bad idea. We need to be a bit more explicit. Instead of using these round the houses selectors to avoid using classes, we need to just say we need a class here. By using a class of intro and putting a class in our HTML, we find that we've got a much more flexible bit of code. That P can live anywhere. That P could be a block quote, it could be a list item. It's very flexible and very predictable. The previous selector was very unpredictable because too many things could go wrong. Something like this is pretty much safe forever. Extensibility, and who's heard of Nicole Sullivan? Good stuff. No, it's quite a lot of people. She's an absolute genius, and she says you should build websites like you're using Lego. And what she means by this is the smaller and more discrete bunches of styling you can make a lot more things with. If you imagine each bit of styling you write as a Lego block, you can use lots of them to make a variety of different things a lot faster. she says we should stop thinking in pages and look a little closer and look at components. So look at your header and your footer, or look at your nav and your breadcrumb. And then across those components, spot repeated design patterns, try and find bits of similar styling and abstract those out into reusable snippets. And those are your Lego bricks. And the reusable snippets we can then share across different elements. We don't care where they live, we just care about how discrete that style is and how quickly we can move it. Predictability, this one's the hardest one to quantify. My little soundbite for this is always build like your client's CMS as a bulldozer. You need to be confident in your code. Predictable code is robust code. Sites can, will, and do change, and we need to be able to handle that when they do. Is that working? Yeah, okay. So one of the simplest ways we can start working towards these four sort of ideals is to go right back to the beginning and look at our CSS selectors. It's the first thing you learn as a web developer, how to select things with CSS. But it's a lot of the time where we make the most mistakes. Avoiding using classes, as I outlined before, can lead to very poor code that you can't move and code that doesn't work very well, code that breaks easily and quickly. The quickest rule you can follow to have an easier life as a front-end developer is just don't use IDs in CSS. You can use them in your HTML for JavaScript hooks and whatnot, but just don't use them in your CSS. When I first heard this rule, I hated it. I didn't use it for a long time after I heard it, because I assumed that I knew what I was doing. I thought, I don't need to avoid IDs. I know I'm a good developer. I can do this. But after I learned this rule, every time I got into an ID-related bit of a situation with my code, I really noticed it. And every time I noticed that I should have used a class, it really stuck with me. So after a few months, I dropped IDs completely, and I'm really glad I did. The big site that I've just finished building, I started off with IDs in that, and they're one of the biggest pain points for me as a developer. They're one of the things that have gone wrong the most often. So the quickest thing you can do to make your life easier is just don't use them anymore. The reasons for this are, if you think about specificity, and I can't say that word, I'm going to call it the S word. The difference in S word between an ID and a class is massive. It's way too big, and it's of no use to anyone. We need to make sure we can bring that difference down and use classes across the board so that we don't get odd style trumps, we don't get selectors that are too specific. It's not dissimilar to important. It's not as ugly, obviously, but it's very, very similar. It's a style trump, and it often wins out over too many other selectors. You compare an ID to a class, and the ID is going to win by an order of magnitude. It's also important to remember that anything you can do with an ID, you can do with a class. Traditionally, you'd use an ID because it's the only instance of that element in a page, because it's unique to that page. But you can do that with a class as well. You can use a class once in a page, you can use it 1,000 times in a page. It doesn't matter, the browser doesn't care whether it's a class or an ID, only you typically do. You can use a class once, and you shouldn't use IDs anymore if you want an easy ride. So, so typically people tell you not to use classes or not to use too many classes, but I'd say use more. The site that I've just finished used div ID equals header, and that had a lot of style information attached to it. And I've sort of restarted a new build now, and instead of using div ID equals header, I use 3 classes. I use 3 classes to style it up. One boxes off the content, another one spans it full width, and then we've got a class of page head, which adds the unique styling to it. But this means that I can build a footer by using those 2 previous classes. I can just use those, and I've got a footer straight away. I can span something full width and box it off using a bit of abstracted style information attached to a class. Then I use a class of page foot, and I add the unique style that way. I've got here that no one really uses classes other than developers and browsers, and of course micro formats and stuff, but we won't concern ourselves with that. Assistive technologies, screen readers, they don't care about classes, they don't read classes. Search engines don't read classes. The only people that read them are the developers. Browsers don't read them, they match them. Browsers don't care what your class is, as long as it can match it to, it can match the HTML to the CSS. I'm sure you've all made demos before where you use a class of foo, and the browser will style that because the browser doesn't care what your class is. People read classes. You should write classes for people, other developers. You shouldn't worry about what people say is semantic and insemantic. You need to make sure that other developers can understand them. I mentioned before that classes aren't subject to semantics like elements are. Nothing really takes any information from them. So a good example of actually, I'm skipping ahead of myself. When I mention a sensible class, what I mean by that is a class that's got longevity, a class that's future-proof, a class that won't get out of date or confusing. The stereotypical example for this is a class of red. And if we're to go by the old-fashioned way of thinking, red means red. If anything, that's a very semantic class. Red means red. But it's insensible in that if we rebrand and red becomes blue, it gets confusing. A browser can understand that. A browser doesn't care that red is now blue. A browser just matches it and gets on with it. A developer who uses a class of red and blue comes out the other end, that's confusing for them. And we should write classes for developers. My proposed solution, which I use, is a class of brand, and it's abstracted enough that it doesn't matter how many times you rebrand, that class always remains current, it always makes sense, it's always sensible. Traditionally, we might be told that this is a very presentational class name, but if you think about it, that's what classes are. They're for presentation, they're style hooks. We don't need to stress as much as we do. If we abstract it enough, we can solve problems for two people here. If the client quickly wants to make something their brand color, you can quickly do that for them. You both win just by using an abstracted class that typically would have been frowned upon. Objects and abstractions are a really interesting aspect of CSS for me, and this one in particular. This changed the way I build websites. The URL at the bottom, I suggest you scribble that down. This article genuinely changed how I work. Nicole Sullivan, who I mentioned before, she came up with this thing, the media object. And I'm sure we've all built websites before with this kind of component, an image with a bit of text to the right of it. It could be a product image and a product description, or it could be an album cover and a track listing. And we could style that up by saying, well, IMG float left, and then P or OL, and we could select that on element, and that would work. But it wouldn't work for long. If the client comes up to you and says they want a read more link under the product description, or a caption under the image, or both, we can't select based on element anymore because we've got two different types of element in there. What we need to do is use the media object to abstract that out. And Nicole Sullivan came up with this genius 3 lines of CSS. We can apply those classes to almost any element, and it will throw it into that sort of image and text mode. And we can, here we are applying it to an IMG and a P, that's fine. But the read more link, we can just pop in a div using extra markup and still, again, extra classes. But this is reusable. This is really good. This is better than what we're typically told is good. We don't need to care what elements we're working with. We can just use classes to style anything. This is an actual screenshot of my Facebook page. Every red box you see there is an instance of the media object. Nicole Sullivan came up with the media object while she was working for Facebook. I just popped some custom CSS into my inspector and turned every instance of the media block red. You'll also see that there are darker red boxes. These are nested media objects. They're very fluid, they're very flexible. The same 3 lines of CSS built every component you can see on that page that's red. And that to me changed everything. That's really impressive. 3 lines of CSS and I can build a dozen different components just by using the same classes over and over. I'll just pop her details up there. If you find anything I say remotely interesting, then follow her. She's an absolute genius. The nav abstraction, and this is what I came up with, and it's really simple. On the Sky site I've been working on, I found myself repeating a sort of list-style non-li float left over and over and over, and after about the 10th time, I thought, well, I can solve this problem once, surely, rather than solving it a dozen times, so I came up with a nav abstraction. And this is just a simple few lines of CSS which throw any list, an unordered list or an ordered list, into horizontal links mode. And the beauty of this, by using a class, we can extend it. So if we want breadcrumbs, instead of using an ID of breadcrumb, we use a class of nav and a class of breadcrumb. We use more markup than typically we would have done. But it means that that's all we need to extend the nav abstraction. To make a breadcrumb, we just need one more class. Double-stranded heading hierarchy, this is a really interesting one. I gave it the rubbish name. I can't think of a suitable name for this. Nicole Sullivan came up with this. She said that every time you define a heading style, define a class that goes with it. This means that if you want a H2 that looks like a H1, you just do H2 class equals alpha. We don't have to write any more custom CSS to do that. We solve that problem once, and we can use the classes to create any number of double-stranded crossovers between elements and class. Okay then, I said I was going to mention grid systems. Now, yeah, people typically hate grid systems, and I definitely used to. But when you start working on sites where things need to change, you need a suitable way of managing layout. You should think of a grid system as a set of shelves. You have your content and your shelves, and they work very well together, but they're two distinctly separate things. You'd find it very hard to put your TV and DVD player together, or have them together without a set of shelves. And you should think of the same for web pages. If you move a component, will the rest of the page collapse up? It shouldn't do. If you abstract the layout into its own layer, you can manage your entire site's layout completely separately to your components. It means you can leave your forms, your header, your nav, you can leave them totally fluid. They will only be constrained by the size of their parent. The good thing about this as well, if you abstract the layout to its own layer, you manage your entire website's structure separately from anything else. It's a lot more robust. When websites break, when front ends break, it's typically a layout issue. The less layout you define, the less chance there is for something to go wrong. If your website breaks and you're using a grid system, you know that it's probably going to be in the same 20 lines of CSS. You know the problem is probably in there. With responsive design becoming a thing now, grid systems are becoming more and more important. You don't want to carry odd percentages on your contact form. You don't want your breadcrumb to have a weird percentage padding. That's not very nice code. I built this tool. You can just pop in some numbers and it'll give you a grid system back out. And grid systems are really important in responsive design. And another really cool thing about grid systems, if you're defining all your layout in the same one place, that's all it should take to linearize your site for mobile. If your layout is controlled by one class, then that is all you need to do to linearize an entire website in one go. Without a grid system, you'd have to undo width on your content area. You'd have to unflirt your nav, for example. By defining layout once and reusing it in a grid system, you can make far-reaching changes in one go. Right, and I've just blitzed through a lot of stuff quite quickly there. I've got a fairly good example, a realistic example of how we can use all this, like combine all this information to solve a realistic problem for a client. We built this website for a client, and it's probably the most boring website you've ever built, looking at it, but we did do it, and this is how we did it. It's dead simple stuff. We could all do this. A couple of IDs, some widths in there, some flirts, and a bit of background color to differentiate the two columns. And the client loves it, and the client wants more blue. They love the blue. Don't know why, but they just want some more, so they want you to build this. Now, theoretically, that's possible. But all the client knows is we've got blue here, and I want blue here, here, and here. As a developer using this code, we're going to find that quite hard to do. We can't reuse that sidebar. Well, the first step we'll take, how do we do it? The first step we'll take is if we didn't use IDs, if we'd use classes, the sidebar is now at least theoretically reusable. We can't reuse it in its current form because it carries a lot of box model, but we can theoretically reuse the sidebar. Another problem, though, is sidebar's a bit presentational. It's a bit too specific. We need to use a more abstract class name. So if we use subcontent, it'd make more sense to have several bits of subcontent. It's just content that's secondary to the main content. The next thing we do, I hope you can see this, it's quite faint. There's a black box around each of the divs. We throw up a grid system. We abstract our layout into its own layer. We let a grid system handle the structure of the site. That means we can take a lot of the widths and flirts away from the components. So now we've got two very, very fluid bits of content. That means to solve the client's problem, all we need to do now is reuse subcontent 3 more times. By using classes instead of IDs and abstracting layout to its own layer, we can solve problems like this before they've even happened. Our old ways of thinking, handcrafting our code, aren't really powerful enough for today's web. Things change a lot faster than they used to, and we need to, as developers, remain professional. We need to be able to do that quickly. We couldn't go back to the client and say, we can do that, but we've used an ID, so I might have to write some more code. We can solve this problem quickly if we start right from the outset. So what are the benefits and side effects of working like this? The benefits and side effects I've found from working like this are sites are a lot faster to build. As we just saw, we can make things a lot more quickly, a lot more rapid. Sites are more robust. Where the grid system's concerned, if we're defining as little layout as possible, there's less to go wrong. And if it does go wrong, we can pinpoint the problem. They're a lot more maintainable, as we just proved. We can adapt to clients' requests quicker than we once could. By using more markup, less IDs, and more classes, we can do a lot more than we previously used to. And more consistent, the media object's a really good example of consistency. If we'd have coded that a dozen times for each unique usage, the chances are we'd get something different. We might use a different padding value just purely by accident. If we reuse things, if we abstract things so that they're reused over and over, the chances of things looking different are a lot slimmer. And a completely free side effect, totally incidental, is we get efficiency benefits on the client side. It's quicker to match multiple classes and reuse them than it is to match one ID. If we can reuse a lot more stuff, there's less to download by the browser, less to evaluate. Builds get a lot more efficient. That's good for the users. Users like fast websites. We're solving a problem for the user there. So what do we do now? We need to make sure we solve the right problems for the right people. Ignore what you've been told about using extra divs. If an extra div will make that site more robust, it'll make the client happier, their site will break less. If using an abstracted class will make your development job easier, if you can do a lot more with thinking less and without having to write any more unique code, that's a lot better for yourself. We need to solve the right problems for the right people. Keep ourselves as developers happy. The only person who cares about your code is you, and you need to make sure you care for the right reasons. Let go of the old good habits of using IDs and not using too many classes, and solve a problem for yourself. Make sure you can change sites at client requests, work faster, work more efficiently. Yeah, so that's it. I blitzed through that very quickly, I'm afraid. It's kind of a lot to talk about. Those are my details there, and Nicole Sullivan's. Like I say, anything you found interesting there, Nicole Sullivan's doing a lot of work for this kind of way of thinking. Got a little bit of time left, actually, so if anyone's got any questions, I'd love to at least try and answer them. Yeah.
Hey, hello. Nice talk, thanks. What do you find about Jonathan Snook's SMAX method?
Say again, sorry, I can't quite hear.
Jonathan Snook, you know him?
Oh, Jonathan Snook, yes.
His SMAX method of working with CSS. Do you find that useful, or?
Say again, sorry, I can't quite hear from you.
Your SMAX talk, his own method he recently launched his own book about, on his CSS method of working with CSS.
So I genuinely can't quite hear what you're saying. This is horrible.
I'm sorry. Yeah, SMAX. S-M-A.
Yeah, I'm familiar with SMAX. Are you asking my opinion on SMAX? What I think of it? Yeah. Oh, right. I should have asked that about 10 seconds ago. Sorry. Yeah, SMAX is fantastic. I've not had a chance to look at it all over yet. It's really good, and it's really good that people are moving towards this way of working. It's a breath of fresh air for developers. UCSS and SMAX are fantastic things. I actually signed up to the SMAX website 2 days ago. I've not had a chance to look through it yet, but I'm really impressed and really pleased that people are moving in that direction. Anything else? We've got one down, yeah.
So I'm curious if you could talk to the balance between, so if we have an ID that's overly specific, talked a lot about the problems with that, but if we start putting 12 or 15 different classes on a single element, so we're mixing in all these different things, now we've created a different kind of brittleness to our site that when we want to change one of those classes, now we've potentially got 50 different places on the page that we might be breaking, so now we've got to go back and add more, change things. So how do we find the balance so that we're not actually brittle?
It's a good question. One thing I would say is if, okay, let's take the media object. If we're reusing that loads in a page, yeah, if you modify the base object, then everything's going to inherit that. That's where you need to be sensible. It's hard to quantify. You just need to know. You need to look at your project from the outset and think, well, is this worth abstracting early, or shall I wait until I need to abstract it? There's no hard and fast rule, but you need to weigh up each sort of case as and when it happens. I think that a lot of people, you mentioned using a lot of classes and having to change it in a lot of places. Now, typically, if you're doing that, there's a chance you should be using includes maybe, or just because using classes lots in a rendered page doesn't necessarily mean we're writing them lots. But it all comes down to individual project context. Luckily, in the last year, I've not had any instances of that. I've got no examples, or I couldn't give you any advice on that. But yeah, I do think I couldn't really give you an answer for that. You'd have to wait and see when it happens.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.